the live button should go up. Very good. Welcome to the Conflict Consortium virtual hangout with Erica Chenoweth and Christian Davenport as the co-hosts. Welcome, everybody. Today we are honored to have the paper. Let me scroll up from all my detailed comments. The impact of unilateral third-party interveners on durability of intrastate peace agreements, implementers or spoilers on post-agreement peace. Let me catch my breath on the end of that one. By Hande, and give me the correct pronunciation for your last name.
It's I now go by Fu. It's Ogutcu-Fu. But I go by Fu, my husband's last name. It's easier.
No, I don't want easy. I want accurate. So just like, thank you very much for providing that. And Andrew Enterline will get us started with comments. Andrew.
Okay. Well, as I mentioned before, it's a pleasure to read this paper. It's a pleasure for a number of reasons. One is it's very polished. It's very well written. The argument is well crafted. The other reason why I liked it so much is because it has a lot of IR in it. As somebody who's coming from IR and studying civil wars occasionally, I really like the IR component because I think that is often overlooked. And in particular, with respect to post-conflict resolution and peace, there's a heavy emphasis on IOs, the UN, and so forth in the literature, but there's not a lot of emphasis on third-party states and their behavior towards these post-conflict societies. So I like that because it feeds my cynical side a little bit, because third parties are often nefarious and have other goals. And so it's important to understand what they're doing and how that affects the post-conflict society. And a lot of these IOs, of course, are instruments of the states. And so we need to uncover that. So I thought you did a really nice job. And I learned quite a bit from this paper. So I like the big idea, and I like the argument. It's very compelling. So the comments that I have are sort of about smaller issues in order to sort of draw out your thoughts about some aspects of the paper. So I'll identify some of these, but you don't need to feel compelled to talk about each of them. And I'm happy to after the meeting here. The first thing is sort of working off the mouthful with the title, and that has to do with this use of the word unilateral. I found that sort of curious, that terminology, and I wondered if maybe you could sort of elaborate on why you're choosing unilateral when it could very well be multilateral interventions. They could be on both sides of the conflict, and so I thought that word sort of misdirected the reader a little bit towards something that wasn't really necessary, and we can sort of simplify that, that the third parties that are present when the peace negotiations are going on are then sort of examined thereafter with respect to their impact. So maybe you could talk a little bit about that. I'm a little curious about who these third parties are. So, because I'm the IR person, right? So it would be helpful to sort of know who they are, what the conflicts are, and who the third parties you're considering in these conflicts. Maybe a little appendix. You know, we're all trying to pare articles down now, but maybe online stuff you could have this. But it would be nice to see were there 60 agreements? I'm sort of can't remember now, but how many of them had third parties and who they were, right? And I'm kind of curious because some of these conflicts are obviously Cold War related, and I'm kind of curious as to who the principal states are that are involved. And so it might help clarify that by sort of walking through who these are. And that was sort of leading me to sort of the next point was as to whether these are the third parties on the government side or the third parties on the rebel side that are the sort of principals here. You have some good examples, though, where the United States is actually stepping in with economic investment, even though they were supporting rebels. But I was just kind of curious if third parties often use rebels to antagonize their enemies. and then they just walk away. The rebels they rarely win. And so I was curious as to whether the support that's going on here that's helping for the durability of peace is really the government side, third parties, or if it's really the United States stepping in and making agreements, and so they're the pivotal player. I don't think that undermines your argument. It's the time period, right? The United States is the capable third party, whereas the Soviets were the antagonists, but didn't have very deep pockets. Particularly at the end, they couldn't even support Eastern Europe, right? So they weren't about to lavish funds on these sort of proxy war states that they supported. They didn't have any money. So I was kind of curious if in the paper, if maybe you could sort of probe a little more about who these third parties are. Right? So I had a little bit of a interest also in sort of the repeated nature of some of these civil conflicts as well. The Angola one seemed to have many chapters, and I wasn't entirely clear as to how you might be handling that kind of repeated nature. And it might be interesting to sort of think a little bit about or examine what was happening in these interludes and why those were sort of revisited in terms of civil conflict. So in the Angolan case, you might sort of think about third parties still clashing or fueling a conflict, or as you mentioned in the paper, this availability of resources, pillaging, looting type resources that would fuel a conflict. So I thought maybe you could talk a little bit about these sort of conflicts that are recurrent, where peace breaks down and is rebuilt and then breaks down again. I wasn't sure how many of those were in the data sample. I have a couple other suggestions here. It seems like the economic model is the best performing model when I look at the performance of it. And I was curious, in the other models with UN voting and conflict and cooperation, some of the controls change and they fade away or they attenuate. And I was kind of curious as to why you thought that was the case. I actually think the economic one is the winner, but I was curious about some of these controls changing. What some sort of thoughts that you had there. Let's see what else I had here. These are quite tiny. I mean, your paper is very good, and so I'm just sort of thinking about some things the reviewers might want to know, but these are not pivotal. I don't think. One thing that's really interesting about the model is the peacekeeping is insignificant. And I wondered, I was thinking you might want to have to put up a forceful investigation of that, because there's a lot of peacekeeping people out there, and they're not going to like that. I like that, of course, but they might not like that. So I think maybe sort of exploring that a little as to why that fades away is probably important to preempt some puzzlement over that. I think it's great finding because it really underscores, I think, sort of a Collier-esque argument that they need economic rebuilding and infrastructure, and they need investment, and these are real things. It's not just, it's not things that the UN can provide. It's what the UN members need to do to get rebuilding. So I like that result, and I think, well, I think it's kind of explosive, so maybe you could write another paper on that part and irritate some people and get famous with the peacekeeping, because I think that's a nice tension there. So if there's not space in this paper for that, you might want to make a preemptive move there in a short way, but then maybe another paper here and get you in a high visibility journal where you can get some debate about that. I think that would be a great option. So that just occurred to me, but I noticed that when I was looking through it. One last thing I thought you could do here, and I'll stop, is the two anecdotal cases that you have on the front. You can take them out of the sample, you can estimate your model, And then you can simulate those two cases using the coefficients. So you can simulate what Angola, its peace agreement would be like, and you can simulate the other case. It slips my mind at the moment. But you can actually do sort of a simulation and give the reader a feel for the accuracy of your model out of sample with the anecdotal case. It's kind of a nice way to end, I think, if you wanted to do that. I've tried that before, and it's kind of nice. I also think it underscores that there is more to be done, and so we might think about that. I thought about that even though I don't really work in this area, but with respect to the model, I was thinking there are other things going on in the state that might affect that. The growth of the military, sort of as a repressive apparatus, the turnover in power, right? Sort of between parties that were representing erstwhile combatants, sort of the health of the political process. I realize that's not what you're doing here. Those aren't your key variables, but I thought there were some other sort of dynamic qualities there that might affect the fate of the peace agreement. I think that's about it for my comments, which I can elaborate and send you later on for sure. But feel free to respond to any of them or none of them.
I'll go ahead, I guess. All right. First of all, thank you to all of you for giving me this opportunity. Just to introduce myself, I'm Hande Ogutcu-Fu from Lincoln University. Thank you, Andy. Those are very valuable comments. I'm going to go ahead and respond to a few and appreciate a few. Sure. So I guess on the issue of unilateral, I was just trying to emphasize that these are states that I'm looking at. I guess there are multiple ways of naming them or terming, using multiple terminologies. I could go with supporter if you think that's going to be a clear way, or if we agree that that's going to be a clear way of wording it. I just wanted to emphasize that these are states. These are not, as you were saying, international organizations, merely states, because states definitely, yes, international organizations also represent states' interests, but there are multiple interests that collide. I'm just trying to here emphasize that these are individual states, and therefore they're going to have much more at stake in terms of the policy outcomes of an agreement. So that was my emphasis. I can definitely go with supporters as a alternative terminology. Who are these interveners? Yes, definitely United States, Soviet Union, they're there. We also, however, see a lot of regional hegemons and regional wannabe hegemons. So we see a lot of, for example, South Africa, we see a lot of Cuba. So I can definitely have there is definitely a Cold War effect, but an appendix, as you were saying, would definitely help out. The government side and the rebel side, yes, I used to in this paper have dummy variables that said, well, are these interveners on the government side? Are these interveners on the rebel side? I dropped it off. I think it was because my models were very cluttered. I can definitely have a model included that has those dummy variables back again. So I can definitely do that. In terms of controls, that one particular, the peacekeeping control that you were suggesting. Yes, I thought that was, all three of these provisions that were included in the peace agreement, they were no longer significant the moment these other variables were introduced. I thought that was a very interesting finding, but I do want to emphasize that this is a peacekeeping provision. So it's like in the agreement, there's a provision specifying that there should be peacekeeping operations and deployed. So that's what it's saying. That's a little different from peacekeeping operations because, you know, they might be introduced, they might not be introduced. You know, what is the quality of this peacekeeping force? We don't know. So it was basically an agreement provision, but I did think that it was rather curious that none of the agreement provisions were as important out of my models, came out to be as important or as significant when compared to this other independent variables that I came to introduce. I love the idea of simulating Angola and Mozambique. Thank you. I'm going to definitely look at that. And any other controls that I might bring in, and that would be helpful. That would be sort of a pre-answer to a lot of the reviewers. I'll take them. So thank you.
Sure, sure.
Okay, queue open. You got something? You want me to go?
Yeah, I'll say a couple things.
Cool.
First of all, Hande, thanks for letting us read this paper. And I'll mention too that you do have two other discussants, John Caverly and Aysegul Aydin, who are participating in the commenting on the paper, but just not on Google Hangouts today because of different circumstances that precluded their participation. But they will be sending you comments. So a couple things. I also really like this big idea. I think Andy's right that you're on to something really interesting around what I would think of more as kind of embeddedness in the international system and relationships between actors as determining change in their kind of arrangements that were built at certain points in time. I have a couple of things that are just more kind of theoretical or questions about the way the paper is set up. The first is also on this point of unilateral intervention as being the focus, when actually it seems to me what your measurement is of dyadic relationships year to year between actors, and you could also imagine many other actors having very similar dyadic relationships that aren't being measured because they didn't happen to intervene in the conflict, right? So you can have good trade relations or increasing trade relations. You can have political affinity. You can have lots of different relationships among actors in the international system that actually look a lot like the one that you're talking about, where you have an intervener interacting with a state that's emerging from civil war. And so one of my questions is just dealing more with isolating why the particular relationship between the intervener and the intervened upon should be the most important one in determining kind of, civil war recurrence. And part of the reason is because exactly the nature of your research question, which is that, sometimes these relationships degrade over time. Sometimes interests diverge and things like that. And, I think that there are, lots of other reasons why civil war happens, like whether a region starts to collapse or something. So you could also imagine it being important to try to incorporate, what the neighborhood is like, and what kind of relationships the state has with other potential friends in the anticipation of losing, for example, the active support of a previous intervener. The second thing I was thinking about is kind of related, which is, this question of why do interests diverge? And you sort of put it as interest or preference divergence. But for me, what you're actually capturing is more a change in the nature of the relationship. Trade integration is a relational variable more than it is an indicator of interest, preference, kind of convergence in my mind. But I could be wrong, and feel free to push back on that if I'm totally getting it wrong. But to me, a lot of your measures like political affinity, trade integration and such feel like embeddedness measures or kind of mutual dependence as opposed to interests converging per se. And that kind of brought up this question for me about whether when you see affinity or integration, you're really looking at interests converging, or whether you're just looking at like a coercive relationship, right? So if it's a very powerful state, they could just say, look, this is how you're going to behave. If we come and help, this country emerge from civil war, you're going to vote the same way in the UN. In the UNGA, you're going to open your markets to us, and such. And so that's like part of the nature of the intervention in the first place. Interveners pick places where they think they have things to gain from intervening. And so I wonder what you might do to deal with the potential selection effect there. And then the last thing I would say is that you sort of frame these what you call like interest convergence or divergence in terms of signaling. That the actual measurement that you do provides signals of what the interests are, and I think that could be true. It could also simply be signs of declining will and capacity, or changing will and capacity. And so, it brings up this interesting questions of why would interests diverge? Is this actually like a domestic politics argument? Is there another paper to be written about, when relationships between interveners and intervened go sour? Like what makes the intervener change its mind about, whether this was a good idea? Is it simply like a leadership change, or a primary party change, or some kind of domestic politics argument? So I think there are lots of other directions you could take it to. But I think that in this, because of the selection effect issue that I mentioned, it might merit a little bit of discussion in the paper about why, we should just be totally agnostic, basically, about the domestic politics within the intervening country, and focus more on just kind of wrap it into this black box of interests that you're talking about.
Okay, that's huge. Take on what you want.
All right. Thank you. Yes, there's a lot in there. So let's see. The neighborhood, nature of the neighborhood. Yeah, that's definitely in there whenever I'm looking at the interveners. Like, for example, in an African conflict, we're definitely a range of factors in the neighborhood also intervene. So part of it through capturing the signals of the interveners, each of the interveners. My hope is that I'm capturing part of what the neighborhood looks like, or how much they're sort of interested, or how much they're involved with everything. Another variable that I did include that sort of looked at things that are other than interveners is, and that had a huge effect, was the resource conflict variable. Of course, resource conflicts definitely changes everything, and you can definitely see the effect in the models. So, but that it doesn't take away the significance of the effects of the other variables. So I think that's, at least important in the sense that although the resource conflict variable is driving a lot of the effect, still there's a lot of significance that can be seen in the intervener-related variables, such as economic interdependence and the UN affinity, etc. So I gave a lot of thought, and I'm still giving a lot of thought as to how I can word things so that I make things as simple as possible for the reader. So putting the wording in that there's a change in the nature of the relationship between the intervener and intervened. I guess that's definitely a way in which I can word things. Because one of the criticisms I had heard in the previous versions of this paper was that I don't really know what you mean by these signals. I don't really know what you mean by average intervener intervenes economic relationship, or heterogeneous relationship, or divergence or convergence. I don't really know. So I kind of, my goal, one of the things that I had a lot of time sitting and thinking, and I really, you know, I need as much feedback on this as possible, is like how to word things that are, so that my argument isn't confusing. My argument is simple enough. So changing the nature of the relationship between the two countries, the intervened and the intervener. I don't think that's actually really different than convergence of interest or the signal. So there's a change in the relationship. So I argue that overall interveners have an effect on the durability of the peace agreement, and this is an aggregate effect. I say that the one of the ways in which we can understand how they affected it is to trace the change in the nature of the relationship, is one way of putting it. I guess these signals that interveners send, not only to the government, but also to anyone who is interested in the conflict, who wants to see how these interveners will affect in the future the durability of the peace agreement. So I don't think it's we're saying different things, but definitely let me know if there's something in there I didn't catch. And another thing I had grappled with was the I guess the potential selection effect problem. And along with that comes, why did you choose these particular variables? And I spend a lot of time trying to sort of legitimize the choice of my variables. Why am I looking at economic relationships? Why am I looking at UN affinity? Why am I looking at overall relationships? Why are they so important for both the intervened and the intervener? So that they actually can serve as really important signals that will trace where the heart of the intervener is. Therefore, which way the intervener will influence the intervened. And of course, with that comes other variables, right? Leadership change is definitely something that I could have included. That would look pretty good next to economic relationships, pretty good next to UN affinity. I guess why didn't I do it is just this, I guess, spatial considerations is gonna be, I'm gonna bring it to that. But definitely one thing I would love to hear more about is, you know, and did I convince you that these variables are important? They're gonna drive the, they're gonna really drive the, as you put it, nature of the relationship.
Okay, so I got Eric on a one. I want to jump in with the two for a second. So we have a couple of things we're talking about at the same time, embeddedness and interest. And so let me parse for 1 second. And the interest thing, sorry, let me start with embeddedness. I agree with Andrew and Erica. I think that is, I think that comes out in your discussion. I buy that, but you give me dyads, and so I feel slightly betrayed. You talk about there's multiple actors, there's multiple interests, there's multiple things going on, and then you just give me dyads. And so I wonder if, in a sense, our political interests are they're nested, right? So you have a particular country, and then you have the relationships of the different parties to that particular country, and then you're going to intervene or not. But part of that intervention function is this country over here is connected to this country and this country and this other country. And so I lose a sense of networks. And that seems to have implications for your interests, right? And so one of the reasons, and you hint at it, so I also feel betrayed there too. So so you have the collapse of the Soviet Union, and then the Cold War, and so that fundamentally shifts what the U.S. is willing to do or not do in the West in general, and other actors as they're now trying to deal with the fact that they can't get support. That's a nested kind of thing, and yet you kind of pare it down to, well, here's how the changing nature of intervention affected the government and the rebels in this one country over here. But we have the shift in context. And so I'm wondering how you can capture this shift in context. But so like the Balcells and Kalavas piece makes me think about shifts in the international system and how that fundamentally shifts all the other interactions, or how shifts in polarity shift all these other things concurrently. And so I know you try to take us to the dyad, but I keep thinking of your argument as being nested in a way. And I'm wondering if there's a way that you could try to get at, so rather than assess an individual country or dyad's trade relations, if you can set my dyadic trade relations with you into the context of my broader trade interests generally, so I can get some sense of importance. Because when you say interest to me, I think of intent, right? It's just like, okay, what do I need? What do I want? I don't get that from your measures, right? I'm getting observables. But again, if you give me kind of like some sense of nesting or embeddedness, then I feel closer to having a sense of understanding how important what you're doing is to my overall interests. And so then that became an issue of interest seems to be connected to embeddedness in the sense that you're making a decision about a particular dyadic relationship as a function of how that relationship fits in with the other relationships that you have. And the way you've measured things seems to kind of push me away from that. But this will sound weird, but Andrew, Erica, does that sound right to you in terms of like your read? Because I think we were consistent with regards to thinking about this embeddedness thing and networking, and then the disjuncture between the networking and the dyad. But
yeah,
any response? Yeah,
I think that was one of my main takeaways was that I was really, I think, I think it's, in one sense, it might be hard to do because it requires some kind of thinking about the unit of analysis in the data, but I don't think it requires rethinking in terms of the variables or the sort of theoretical setup, right? So I think it's doable, but if that's not what you want to do, if really what you want to do is identify how changes in relationships between interveners and those that they intervene change over time, and how that change affects the durability of peace settlements, that's a much narrower kind of approach and a much more modest kind of research design. But what I would suggest in that case is that there would have to be some treatment of selection effects and things, because, you asked if we were convinced about like whether the variables were, whether the story you tell is what's really going on. And for me, the question is, how good of friends were they before? So the interveners are picking places to intervene strategically, and they're likely places that they either already have political affinity and trade integration, or they want it and are using the intervention as a pretext to pull this place closer into their sphere of influence or whatever. And so, part of the question for me would be then dealing with where do they go, and then what is the whether we really see them as kind of trying to alter their incentives to stay by becoming more integrated trade-wise and the like, or whether we can really just kind of anticipate which types of interventions are going to be weak and changing over time based on how close they were before. So those are kind of, I think, the two different directions you should take it. I think right now you're closer to the one that Chris and Andy and I are talking about in terms of the setup. And so the sort of empirical approach, I think, would have to just be a little bit adjusted.
What would be an alternative then to capturing? Like, do you have any sort of suggestions as to how I can capture a broader embeddedness in the model? And so all suggestions welcomed, I guess.
I mean, the first thing that comes to me is, isn't there literature that kind of identifies, so it like talks about treaty embeddedness, right? So how many simultaneous signers are there to something? And then, but it's an issue of how many different treaties have different groups kind of signed. And then to the degree to which you're actually able to identify a nesting cohort, be like, okay, so I'm partnered with this individual, but this individual is partnered with all these other people. Isn't this the kind of like the centrality measure? I mean, there's measures in this network sets. And so you could basically take the data that you have, but you're creating a network out of it. But I'm not sure of, and so maybe Andrew knows this one better, but in the IPE literature, there's got to be something on the interdependent nature of different trading partners and how isolated versus integrated those particular traders are, in a sense of trying to gauge whether or not someone's kind of like going it on their own, or they are intricately connected with somebody, and that degree of centrality of trade would then give you a different measure of kind of like the relationship or something like that. Andrew, does anything exist like that regarding trade or trade dependence?
Oh, I'm afraid that's out of my bailiwick.
My bad. All right.
On trade, but I would suggest this. When I originally read the paper, you know, my gut reaction is sort of what Christian is saying here, and Erica, about the ball cells, you know, kind of shift in the system that's affecting these all simultaneously. There's a lot of agreements in the early 90s, Nicaragua, El Salvador. They're all happening at the same time, same precipitating conditions. And but I thought, well, I usually go down that path, like the Cold War dummy's not significant, which is strange. Like I didn't know how to interpret that. But one thing you might do is this. How about some plots? You have your anecdotal cases. Let's see the trade pre and post Civil War of the principles. You're talking about change. Let's see those trajectories of not even just trade, but the three variables that you're interested in. Let's see if it's changing, and give the reader a little feel for those cases and those variables. For example, in Afghanistan, right, when the Soviets got out, they signed a treaty and they walked away, and the US walked away. That was it. And Afghanistan, I'm afraid to say, went back to the 15th century, right? And the Civil War started again, and we had the whole. So I don't know what kind of investment there was, but I don't think there was a lot, right? Some of that has to do with the nature of the state itself. Afghanistan wasn't a trading country, right? So it's not really a. I guess I don't know what its UN voting record is like, but it was a mess. So I don't even know if they had that capacity. But you could show that, right? You could show that in that case there was no investment, and it just devolved into a big mess, right? Some of it might be the starting point, as I said. You know, their country is sort of is different than Angola, which had Portuguese, some infrastructure and some connection to Europe, and could be revived. So you might illustrate that, you know, the connection of the Civil War state with the outside world. So that might be one way to go. I'm hesitant to kind of force you to get misdirected too much. I think it's a nice little paper. I think it's a great agenda. So I think some of these things could be taken on in additional papers, right? So I agree with my colleagues here, but I'm worried that if you go the sort of big systemic route, that could be a problem. But I also agree that the signaling language and so forth, I almost think of it as investment. Like they're investing in this country after the Civil War. because as Erica said, they want something. They wanted something when they got there, or they wanted something else, like they wanted to fight their rival, but now they want the oil, and so they're investing. And so it's interest and investment. I'm not sure what kind of, if it's a signaling thing, but they're investing. So maybe the language up front is ambiguous when it's really just, it's just material and instrumental. You know, they're going to get something out of that. Whereas in Afghanistan, it was purely great game. It was purely power politics. If they'd only known the Chinese would find all those resources, they would have stayed in, but they didn't know that then, right? And they left, right? So I that's what I have to say. I'm sorry I don't know more about networking. I don't know enough about that. Politically, particularly political economy, I don't have any expertise in that.
I mean, so to be clear on my suggestion, I'm saying that with the language you have now, I envisioned this kind of like embeddedness and networking type of thing. And then you took me to dyads. So if you want to keep what you have right now, I just think you need to change the frame. So I'm looking for less of that overarching kind of ambitious integrated nature. Because then you had me thinking of, oh, wow, okay, so I'm going to see something about political embeddedness and political networks and economic relations and military relations. So I was like looking for something like for a discussion of AFRICOM, because I'm like, well, the U.S. changes their position on Angola because they want Congo destabilized. South Africa is no longer a party, and Rwanda kicks in as an enforcer for the region that they can manipulate. That's a nesting of different types of things that takes you out of the dyadic discussion that you have. But if you want to talk about interests, then it seems like you need to think of these kind of like, in a Busan-like sense, these kind of regional kind of concatenations of nations that their relationship, their dynamic interaction shifts the nature of the interest that you'd have with any one of those parties because these other things are happening. And so, but your language led me there to have this reading. If you want to make it about kind of signal, I buy the argument very, very clearly that the signals that are providing some kind of general sense of reinforcement or degree of investment or type of investment, and that we could take those signals to mean, okay, because I always found the kind of like the use of information in the bargaining stuff to be very light. They don't really come up with a measure for it. You're actually trying to get to a measure, right? It's very much in line with the, battles tell you something about fighting capability. And you're kind of like day-to-day interactions regarding trade and communication tell you something about how committed you actually are. And so I think that's very reasonable and natural. But there's something about, I like grandiose language, so that's why I gave you my suggestion of going for embeddedness. But you have a very kind of grandiose setup up front regarding interactions and across dimensions and all these other things. And then your measurement it's very kind of particular and very specific. Not that either is right, but I think a better match would go a longer way. My take. And Q is open. So.
Well, Hande, do you want to reply to anything we've said or anything? Yeah, we get back into it.
Thank you. First of all, I'm definitely gonna sort of weigh out my options. There's a lot of networking literature out there, and then obviously with that comes sort of potentially completely redoing the empirical models, or doing less, but like doing sort of more with less. So I'm gonna definitely weigh out my options in terms of what would be sort of better for the paper, and so that it's clear, it's publishable in a not so distant future, but still it has as much. I mean, if the last thing I want is to let a reader down, right? So sort of whether it be, I'll weigh out my options as my take on it. So thank you. You gave me a lot to work with and think about.
Be careful though. You'll always let readers down. Never use that. But Erica, you were saying something.
Yeah, we all let all our readers down all the time. So don't use that. Your standard for success. But I think one thing I would say about the I was actually just more curious about the dependent variable. So can you talk a little bit about your interest in the durability of peace settlements specifically, as opposed to, say, Civil War recurrence as a dependent variable?
Quite honestly, I sort of, so this is one of, this is the final chapter of my dissertation that I've been working on. It's been filed already, but it sort of came with this, the dissertational role was about negotiations and negotiated settlements. So Civil War recurrence, as opposed to, wouldn't be about peace agreements or wouldn't be about negotiated settlements. That's why, I mean, it has a very simple explanation to it. But now, I already filed my dissertation a long time ago. It's now a paper to be published. So when I sort of was reviewing the literature, that idea occurred to me as well. Should I use, instead of using durability of peace agreements, should I go ahead and use Civil War recurrence instead? That definitely, that's something I considered. And would you sort of Civil War recurrence as in, like in 5 years, do we have a civil war or not, a binary variable? Was that something that you were suggesting?
Well, I don't know if I'd suggested. I was just curious about just whether that was because you were mostly interested, as you've just answered, in political settlements and their durability. The only reason I ask is because I'm not sure what the distribution of conflicts is actually, but my sense is that there are a lot of them that don't end with political settlements, but certainly have lots of intervention. And so I was just curious, as an expert in this area, whether you see that the basic arguments that you're making would be different, right, if there wasn't a political settlement, or if there was. Because it strikes me most of your mechanisms could apply to cases outside of those where there was a political settlement. And you could just, it's sort of like the case Andy brought up about Afghanistan. I don't know if there was a political settlement there. That conflict ended and all the interveners left, right? There wasn't the long-term investment, but you can imagine lots of conflicts where there was a victory of some sort, or just an end of the conflict without any kind of, real formal written agreement per se, that would maybe qualify it for inclusion in that kind of set of dependent variables. And I was just kind of curious whether you think your argument transports to other cases.
I mean, yes, there were there were many settlements that failed in Afghanistan, but which comes to the whole argument of the major distinction would be between a potential settlement that's to end civil war versus, let's say, victory, would be perhaps fragility. And in terms of how tempting would it be for the signatories to revisit the former status quo and go back, since the assumption here, when we have a peace agreement, the assumption is that it's a compromise. So a compromise, it's is generally potentially more fragile, versus if you have the drowning out of a rebel group completely, it's gone, it's rooted out, oftentimes very, very violently. Then there's really no one left to tempt with your, with your sort of, with your signals, right? So I guess the major distinction would be that, that I can think of really. But there was a very, a very, very real, like day to sort of a very the nature of my the reason why I chose my dependent variable was pretty much because in my dissertation I wanted to look at the negotiation stage, the negotiated settlement stage, and then the durability of that negotiated settlement, that third stage, so that it could sort of would be a cohesive whole in the dissertation, like or in a book. With, dissertation being a book, that was the major thought driving it. But there's definitely some kind of a fragility argument to be made, you know, that differentiates a country enjoying peace because they ended the war with a peace agreement versus there was a complete toppling of a government, or there was complete rooting out of a rebel group.
I mean, my two on this is an interesting one, right? So durability of peace is one way to frame the same thing as conflict recurrence, but these are different audiences. You can serve as an important bridge to bring these two back together, highlighting how they're different and how they're the same. But we also need to acknowledge, in a sense, you're in the positive peace realm in many respects, although you don't use that language. So, right. So the negative piece is there's no recurrence of the conflict. Positive piece of what things are happening between the actors that is moving you even further away from this possibility. So communication, all of these things you're actually identifying are in that realm, and so you can build audiences and pull people together, I think, in a way that would be benefiting, in the sense that you could unify. I mean, it's a conceptual distinction, recurrence or peace duration. It's the same variable, and so it's very frustrating that folks haven't necessarily brought them together. That was my two. My one was, speaking of the conflict, it's not in your piece. So it's like, it could be that if the conflict went on for a long time, you killed a lot of people, or like, you know, so battle deaths, duration, and scope, the number of people that were involved, that's why you don't go back again. And your comments just there revealed that, you know, you're just like, well, you just might have decimated the challenger. And so, interestingly enough, in the piece, when I was thinking of, like, well, you know, what's the quality of that peace conversation, right? I'm writing a book with Eric Melander and Pat Regan on peace, so I'm all about peace stuff now. But the quality of that piece could be this one of the actors are devastated. And what we're seeing is durability of peace is really a devastation of the playing field, effectively, and like all the players are dead, and there's all types of depression and fatigue, and so that's something that easily could be introduced because we have those measures, but it's a very different way than, because that for me gives me interest, in a sense that comes closer to helping me understand context. Because that context is not currently in, and I'm just kind of wondering, why was that not in there? I presume that's in the other chapters. You tried to kind of like keep them out, but I'm like, it clearly has implications for this, which would be useful to kind of integrate. And did you run some models that had kind of the conflict experience in there? But this is interesting, right? Because the way you laid out your chapters, not to go there, but the way you laid out your chapters makes me think of the kind of Hegre et al. Piece that looked at Civil War onset, variation, and duration concurrently in the same model, arguing that we can't really understand any of these without understanding all of them at the same time. So you might consider that. And sorry again for asking you multiple questions at once, but I guess that's actually a good sign, right? Your piece is very provocative, so you're thinking a bunch of things. And when you receive my comments, you'll see I have comments all throughout it, but I keep verbally doing it. So sorry about that. Yes.
No problem, and I actually really appreciate it. You're definitely right. Why are those variables not there? Because they were left in the other data set that was looking at a two-stage Provet model, pretty much negotiation onset and negotiated settlement onset. Like, I had all those variables there. Then when I look at the derivative of peace agreements, I don't have them in there. Those are available. I'll put them back in that data set. So you're right. The conflict needs to be in there. So that's definitely a negligence on my part. I agree. And with civil war recurrence, there's, of course, there's always a, if I have space, it has to do, of course, with how I'm gonna redo the paper. But if I do have space, including civil war recurrence as another dependent variable is something that can easily also be done. I don't know what you think, but that's a potential route that I can maybe also go.
Erica.
Yeah, I mean, I think actually that would be really interesting and informative, because it helps us understand like the mechanism that you're trying to get at, where these are two players that actually are trying to tie themselves together in a meaningful way through a peace settlement that involves, you know, third-party intervention explicitly for enforcement and implementation and everything else. And to me, that strikes me as a really useful contribution if you're trying to get to kind of what the practical implications of the argument are. Because if it's true that interventions with kind of really clear mandates for long-term, you know, multidimensional integration are totally different, which we would expect, I guess, that they would be, then intervention and then staying after to make sure the rebels don't come back or something might be a really different set of policy implications. So yeah, I have another one finger too, but anyway, I just wanted to agree with you on that. That might be a really useful way to differentiate what, you know, and sort of motivate the reason why studying this dependent variable is important, even if it's, you know, kind of narrowing the set of cases under study.
Hande, do you want to respond, or you ready to roll?
I'm ready. I agree. We're agreeing.
Okay, Erica, you're one.
Yeah. So this is actually more about the practical implications. What is the key takeaway here? So if I'm a country that has a political settlement, I'm trying my best to emerge with that thing implemented successfully. Is the implication from your findings that I should vote the same way and become more economically integrated with the country that has come in and intervened in the course of the conflict? And for the intervener, what exactly is the implication? Should I be trying to vote similarly should I be coordinating in some way? Like, what are the behaviors that you're talking about, like economic integration and political affinity? Are those things that you wanted to try to create and manage and maintain, or are they just things that happen to happen because, say, there's a colonial legacy, right? So you know, the French, the Francophone African conflicts are going to just have more affinity to, you know, French interveners and more kind of trade opportunities because of the nature of the sort of post-colonial situation. So is that really just something that is sort of residual, or is it something that you can do to create a higher probability of success in your peace settlement?
I think that while there's a traditional relationship that's ongoing, I think that let's say if let's say France is upset about the policy outcomes of Chad's agreement, and sort of all of a sudden reverses sort of halts some of the relationships that have been ongoing. That's much stronger of a signal that would be visible. So while these relationships are some of these relationships are very traditional due to some of the factors such as colonialism, that doesn't necessarily mean that they can serve as important signals. If you're suddenly breaking this relationship that is costly to maintain, or the government is, or the intervened government is severing that relationship to send a signal to you saying you're no longer the boss of me, and therefore we can still from that sudden halt of the relationship, or decrease in the positive relationship, we are gonna still see that, well, there's definitely some kind of a deterioration in the nature of the relationship. And from that, we can definitely say that intervener is going to be unhappy, either because they have severed the relationship, or the government has severed the relationship and they're unhappy because of that. And they're definitely gonna for example, encourage the if we're talking about a rebel group that they had been traditionally supporting, we're going to see some kind of why don't you go back to the battlefield and renegotiate this outcome, kind of tempting temptation towards the rebel group. So that doesn't, it's traditional relationships can definitely serve as clear signals as well.
Actually, I think what you just said really helped clarify to me why you think changes in the status, like who are they signaling to, right? And this is actually a really strong justification, actually, for limiting your study to political settlements, where what we presume is that there wasn't a major victory by one side, that you do still have armed mobilization potential, and that because of that, the signals that are sent by those that have been involved in the conflict about their commitments to continuing to enforce the agreement are actually really important in affecting the sort of motivation or expectation that resumed mobilization or spoiling the agreement would be in these different local actors' interests. So that actually strikes me as much more consistent with the research design that you put out, but maybe didn't come as clearly at the front end of the paper. But that was a really useful description you just gave.
What she said, I agree completely.
Okay, I was trying to. I think these are great comments, because Christian's comment about the Civil War and the devastation, it passed through my mind, and it's an excellent idea that context has to be there. I mean, you think about Syria, right? I think Collier says for every year of civil war, it takes 10 years to recover, or something like that. It's something crazy. So that might be important. I think it is. The other thing I was thinking about is, as Erica and Christian had talked about, these sort of pre-existing relationships, Francophone Africa. Probably the most extreme case I can think of is Cambodia, where the Vietnamese move in, they put their man in Havana, and they get a peace agreement, but this is definitely a colonization of Cambodia. And so that's a pretty extreme case, but it might be useful to think about something like that, where Francophone Africa, Cambodia, that's a little different than the U.S. and Angola. So U.S. is maybe cultivating economic relationships and so forth, but it's a little different. And I don't know if that can be expressed in the model, but that behavior is there, and we might want to think about that a little. I don't know how much activity there was by the U.S. and Angola before the Cold War, Civil Wars there, but we know that France is, and these countries are heavily involved in these areas before these conflicts, and so it might be worth thinking about a little bit.
Yeah, I'm wondering if. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, it would be easy to just say, is there a colonizer relationship? Like, is there a colonization relationship between any of the intervener and the intervened? In many of the interveners and the intervened, that's a dummy variable that is easy to introduce and potentially useful. Yeah.
Yeah, I was thinking maybe some of the way of getting at the nuance that we seem to be suggesting is to acknowledge this variation in civil wars, right? So, because right now, a civil war is a civil war, right? It just it's in the UCDP list, that's it. But we have some sense of, we think ethnic civil wars are different. We think perhaps these post-colonial legacies are differentiating them. So maybe you can get some play at some of this whole issue of how much kind of interveners have a particular distinct shift in behavior if we get some of this legacy, if we can understand that not all civil wars are the same. And in a sense, I don't think the literature now believes that the civil wars are the same, but in this analysis they are. And so I'm wondering if to that extent, you might get some better play at understanding when shifts in actors could actually have an impact if it's not connected to this. And maybe it's not just the kind of colonial legacy, right? But if there was an anti-colonial war fought, that has implications for whether or not you're ready to go back to fight later. And so then you'll be capturing this legacy of conflict as opposed to legacy of accommodation, because in a sense, you're kind of getting at this post-conflict settlement situation. And then we're trying to see, okay, how robust will this be? But maybe one indication of how robust this would be is how many times we've fought previously. And so this is not just the kind of like, give me the characteristics of the conflict, but give me the history of all conflicts in this area, in a sense, trying to kind of figure that out. This is different from the variation that exists in Civil War point, but I think it relates. Because listening to Andrew kind of mention these cases, and it's funny, right? I think we all have like leverage cases that we have, and we're just kind of like familiar with certain things and we'll always mention them. And that's how we think about these. You as writer can't think about that, right? My case is Rwanda, the US, and India, Northern Ireland. Okay, that can't be in your mind, but that's in my mind. And so to the extent to which you can kind of get me out of my head to give me some context for how to get to your mechanisms and your analysis, the better that is. And actually this conversation I think will be useful. You should definitely go back and hear it, because some of your answers and some of Erica's recastings of kind of like what you said, but reframed, I think helped clarify things for me. But now my clarification is now iterative. So I'm trying to keep the modifications that are coming from this conversation in my head as I'm thinking about what was there. And so that's way too much for me to do. But it's your paper, so so you should be doing that. But I think it's helpful. Andrew.
Yeah, let me chime in here and say that my weakest ability is what Erica and Christian have pointed out about the front end. I think that's very important, and I don't often see that as much. And I think you want to pay attention to their points there about the frame and the language, the signaling, and so forth. I think that's critical. I got distracted by Unilateral, but then I was off to the model. But the packaging, I think, here is very important. And I think when you go back and listen to that, that's going to be paramount, because readers who aren't like me, who are paying attention, are going to have expectations, and they're going to get dissatisfied or something like that. And there's a lot of literature on this stuff. So there's a lot of people are primed, and the reviewers are primed and have preconceptions. So I think I want to encourage you to pay attention to those points. I think Erica's points about the package and the peace agreements, that's something you really want to clarify, I think.
Part of the enterprise of us engaging in this effort is to throw things at you or toss things your way, and then you do what you choose to do with them, right? You could ignore them, you could hit them, whatever. In that spirit, so when you first started giving me divergence, I immediately go to Deutsch and like Eckstein. You don't go there. You went a different way. But in the Deutschian sense, I don't think he would have advocated for the different divergence models, right? So you run them separately. But I think there's a question as to whether or not the divergences can fit together. And what that tells you. Are they mutually reinforcing that would get you to this overall meta sense of divergence or convergence that would then have the biggest impact? And as you have them right now, they were modeled separately. And so have you pulled them together? Have you done some kind of like analyses to see if they load together or whatever in a factor analytic sense? But I had that interest. I'm like, oh, you have these interesting, you have divergence, 3 different ones. I'm like, but aren't they linked?
Yeah, include them in the same model. No, I haven't done that. That's something I've been meaning to do. Thank you.
Queue is open. Andrew.
So I'm nuts and bolts here. So I thought what you could do here is show the relative impact to these variables that are in that model, right? So you mentioned that resource was really a driving effect in the recurrence, and maybe you could give the reader a sense of the sort of relative effect. We can read, those of us that know hazards can look in these, but maybe you could give us a sense of the relative effect of these variables, right? Some simulations or something that would show how relatively important your variables of interest are as well. Said a couple of things.
Yeah. Add another one, or you want to find it? You good?
I guess that's all I have. I just wanted to see some of the simulations and variables. Yeah, go ahead.
I had a quick one, which was kind of like so in this kind of like bargaining signal language, there's 2 parts, right? So you need a signal that is clear, and then you have to have a signal that is heard, and the hearing of the signal kind of puts you into behavioral economics and perception and so forth. But to never mention that for me was always problematic, right? So from your perspective, as long as a signal is sent, then we're done. And I'm kind of like, but there's all these different biases and stuff like that on the response end of that signal. And so if I got it, I would be making that question. It was like, well, you know, signals might not necessarily be clear. Why would we think that? How could they be distorted? And maybe that's related to prior conflict behavior. Maybe that's related to network. I'm not sure, but I thought of that one. And related to that, you kind of have interactions, and you talk about frequency and range, but then at the same time, you don't talk about the kind of depth of interactions or the meaningfulness, and they're not necessarily weighted. So, right. So if the US does something, is that weighted at the same degree as if South Africa or some other African country does it? I don't think so. But I'm not sure how that factors into your kind of coding of interactions, right? In a very kind of like Weiss sense, you could weight these in accordance to one's power position or something.
The weighting, yeah. Usually when one hegemon sort of starts to initiate a certain type of behavior, there are a few other interveners that sort of follow suit. So you're right that there's definitely, it's not all relationships are weighed the same way. I mean, this I don't know if this might be sold with just as one of the interveners a superpower. Is that sort of like that dummy? Does that sort of, I mean, it will partially solve the problem. It will at least address it, acknowledge that it's there. But a longer way of sort of dealing with that is, of course, the way you said, through weighing these kinds of relationships, I guess.
Because I'm wondering how this gets back to your issue of interest, right? So if I'm following you, as opposed to I've initiated, does that tell us anything about degree of interest? And this kind of gets back to kind of entrepreneurs and bandwagons and so forth. So if a hegemon has led and then like 5 countries come behind and they're doing something, do we believe that they're actually interested, or are they playing to the hegemon's hegemonic position and they're trying to signal to them. It's less about the conflict, actually. Maybe they're signaling to the hegemon that, yo, no, we're with you. Help us on this deal over here. And so, but that gets to kind of the complexity of interest and intent, which is, you don't give me anything on that one, so you let my imagination run. You need to rein me in as a reviewer. I'm just like, okay, so when I say interest, I mean this, and define it. And back to your divergence comment earlier, you handle reviewers by providing very clear definitions for what you mean by it and footnote alternatives, but at least I know what you mean, and then we're done. And if someone has a problem with it, then they need to go address it somewhere else. It's like, what's your definition? Why did you select it? What are the alternatives? That's all you could do. And that basically eliminates, I think, a lot of problems downstream.
Okay. Yeah. Definitely, I'll go ahead, and you're right. Definitions definitely, of course, matter. And I'm gonna go ahead and make sure wherever there's a term being used is immediately and like earlier on in the paper defined, so that's that's at least something to address any reviewer concern. In regards to unclear signals, I hear what you're saying, but I don't know if you like sort of have a suggestion as to how I could address that.
So I clearly acknowledge that the kind of like, clearly I think bargaining theories and that like would be on one side, and behavioral economics and diversity economy and them are on the other side, and never the twain shall meet. And if you're citing one, that you're probably not going to get reviewed by another. I'm just frustrated that that is the state of our existence, especially when the behavioral economics people appear to have presented some compelling freaking evidence that has dramatically transformed how we understand information and communication and cognition. So I'm just like, I'm always looking for that. I never get it. And so whenever I see anything that's based on information or bargaining, I'm just kind of like, well, what about misperception? But then you have a very kind of implicit model about actors being present in the international system, and actions are taken, and these actions are understood the way you intend them to be understood. And so I'm just kind of like, I guess I just have to roll with that paradigm and then accept it. But then that Tversky and Kahneman person in me is kind of like, well, doesn't framing matter? Why would I see all these things properly? What if I've just recently had an attack on my own sovereign state? Will I perceive that in the same manner as if I didn't? And so there might not be any easy way to kind of resolve that. And it's just a frustration with the discipline about how we're fragmented. And it seems like many people are trying to pretend like the behavioral economic stuff doesn't exist, and they're doing the same. And so that just doesn't seem to be, it's a way, I guess, we've survived, but not necessarily thrived as a discipline. So I want to thrive. I wish to thrive. So yes.
Right. I mean, I'm quite honestly, I teach Tversky all the time. I'm a fan. I definitely hear your concern. But on one hand, the pragmatist in me thought about my audience, both as a dissertation writer and as an article writer. And sort of, that's why I probably didn't really stop and think and really think long and hard about unclear signals. Therefore, I was sort of thrown off a little. But then I'm like, well, you're not, in my head, I'm thinking to myself, you're not really practicing what you're preaching, as in like you're teaching all this stuff to your students, and where are you sort of paying attention to it? So I definitely, that's something I definitely noted down, and I'm going to think about in general as I'm also crafting other arguments in other articles.
Okay, so off the top of my head, so if we go back to the kind of like Weiss idea type of data, it could be that whatever's going on with your particular country, where you are on the scale, influences how you read other people's scale. So if you've just recently been subject to an attack, you might be more prone to kind of like weigh those more aggressive conflictual matters in a more intense way than they're actually being perceived. And maybe there's something to be said about, because then you could leverage data that you already have, right? So then basically I'm looking at the WISE code for a particular country regarding all of the countries minus the particular dia that you're interested in to understand how they would be conditioned to kind of read that. That's a slightly different thing, but it is a way to kind of get at it, maybe in a subsequent paper. But it's really kind of, it's an interesting, lucrative area, and I'm kind of like, I'm always curious as to kind of why no one's really gone there, because most of the behavioral economic stuff is much less global in analysis, right? And they're doing more smaller scale stuff and chasing it out. But there are implications for some of those arguments for the broader community. But clearly you don't need to address everything in a single paper. And I think you're right on gaming it in terms of, in all likelihood, someone that cares about that is not going to read it. But it's this weird bifurcated existence we have, right? Where we're just like, yeah, that stuff's really compelling and really interesting, but now I'm going to write this paper to get published to get tenure. And so it's more professional dig than anything else. So quite frequently, so we started a little late, but we're kind of like, we'll give you a couple more minutes. But normally we try to end with the author quickly querying the group as to kind of like whether I've been struggling with some things or this conversation has led me in a particular way. How would you weigh on it? But if you had that, what would you come up with? And if nothing comes to mind, that's fine. You could just query us later on, and that would be perfectly acceptable as well. But we want to kind of give you the last say, so to speak.
Okay. First of all, thank you. It's really, this has been really productive, really beneficial for me. So I'm going to start off with thanking you for for all the comments and for this opportunity. I guess one of the you gave me a few things to go with in terms of making things clear for my reader and especially the reviewers. So that was something I had in my mind, how to clarify, how to make sure when reviewers read it, they all got the argument and they're all thinking about the same thing. If a few of these are especially Erica's like sort of rewording of some of the things, and then the unilateral intervention being questioned by all of you. I don't know if you would encourage me to use the word supporter instead, and then go with sort of explain what I mean, the way I explained at the beginning what unilateral third-party interveners mean. Along with that is divergence. Before divergence, before using the word divergence, I was using heterogeneous interests. Some readers did not like that wording. That's why I sort of said, maybe I should, or I was also using variance as a way of capturing. I finally settled on divergence, but I can definitely, this is not, it's not set on stone. So I can definitely, if divergence isn't clear, I can move on from divergence to more clear ways of capturing some of the variance in interveners' interest, multiple interveners' interest. So that's, again, related to terminology, something I'm concerned with. And finally, I don't know if this is really a right setting, but I'm gonna give it a stab anyway, at it anyway. So do you have any journal in mind that this would fit in, sort of, you would say, yeah, this is a good fit? So I guess those are the three parting remarks or questions that I have.
Erica?
Yeah, so this has been a really fruitful and informative conversation. I think I have a much clearer idea of what you're trying to do with this paper. And so the way I would set it up to your questions is, first of all, saying political settlements at the end of civil wars present a particularly vulnerable kind of ending because they always contain in them the seeds of recurrence, right? If something fails, or if the different conflict actors are still existing and have mobilization capacity, then they're always waiting to see whether the terms of the agreement are going to be met. We know from the Civil War literature that many times in armed conflict, especially civil conflict, third-party enforcement is required to provide guarantees to the different conflict actors that they can expect for the different terms of the agreement to be implemented. What you're showing in your analysis is a really great international dimension of third-party enforcement signaling, right? So I would actually do away with interest, divergence, convergence, and I would focus totally on the way that the nature of the relationship between the third-party enforcer and the local actors can change when there are visible changes in the relationship, basically between, and you can use trade integration, political affinity, and the like, but how changes in those relationships can signal to local actors the level of resolve and commitment of these third-party enforcers to the success of a peace agreement. And then the fact that you might see degradation in that relationship, that is, conflict over trade, conflict over political beliefs or ideologies or proposals in UNGA or whatever, might actually threaten that third-party enforcer's willingness to continue to invest. And if that's true, then what does that say to the local actors? It says, you know what, like, we don't think this peace agreement is actually going to be implemented. And if that's true, and we're unhappy with our status quo, then that might present a strong incentive to spoil it or violate the terms and see if you can hold out for better gains. And so that might then explain why you would see different conflict actors on the ground reneging, right? So that's basically what you show, I think, in the empirics. And I think that is a very simple but novel and interesting story that does, like Andy say, pull in really interesting IR insights into like more kind of local Civil War dimensions, and I think is very interesting and compelling. It also has, of course, then really important policy implications. So if you are one of these third-party enforcers, and by the way, I would urge you to use that kind of language instead of unilateral intervener, because it nests more clearly into, I think, the literature that you're speaking to, like Barb Walters stuff, on like why you would need like enforcement, third-party enforcement in civil conflict. It actually gives us really powerful implications for third parties who might actually not be fully aware about how their behavior at the international level alters these civil conflict dynamics. And that's really interesting, right? So if what you get to say is, look, like, it might not seem like a big deal to you if you decide not to really invest in trade with the country that you say you're trying to help emerge from civil conflict, but it really matters to the domestic actors on the ground because they take it as a sign of whether you're serious about helping see through the implementation of this accord. That's really important, right? But wouldn't necessarily be something that we would get to if the conversation kind of stays in a more abstract realm of signaling interest, convergence, divergence, and the like. So that's what I tell you. In terms of journals, aim as high as you can. I mean, the worst thing that happens is you get rejected, but actually that's not even the worst thing that happens, because you'll get, if you aim as high as you can, you'll get excellent comments and a quick rejection. The worst thing that happens is that you get a very, you get an 18-month rejection with poor comments. So like that, hopefully that won't happen. But I would aim as high as you can and really tighten this piece up and send it out to the top, and then, you know, work your way down. And I can send you some comments about what I consider to be the top privately. So,
okay, Andrew, anything?
That was, I mean, the wording, the shaping, reframing of the argument, that was wonderful. I took as many notes as possible, and I'm going to re-listen and take more notes.
Okay, I mean, Erica really put it eloquently and completely. So I don't want to counter any of that. I think that's great advice. I think the language can trip people up. And we're using very technical language because we're political scientists, but I think it can be smoothed over with some easier language. I'll try to send some ideas if I think of anything there. But I think it's a great piece. And I think when you send it out, you need to suggest some IR people as reviewers. Because I think IR people will like this because it has a strong IR component. It's provocative and it sort of generates a lot of ideas. And I think what's going to happen is they're going to like this paper, and they're going to have a lot of ideas. And so that's probably what this paper is going to generate. With different sets of reviewers, you're going to get a lot of different ideas, and that's good. It's hard, but it's good. But I think if you smooth over the language and the front end about the signaling and the investment to the actors, that'll help the paper quite a bit. Try to preempt some of these issues with the model. Even if you can't clutter the model more, you can have a footnote that sort of acknowledges that exists. But I think you want to do what Erica said. I think you want to go up. And, you know, I look at it and I think JCR or JPR or something like that. But I think you need in your career to go up to the top, and hopefully you'll strike it. But I also think you should now think about some other papers that'll come out of this. I like the peacekeeping one. There's obviously a network systemic part of this that might be explored. And I think you really have a great agenda going. It's not the end, it's the beginning, right, of some additional papers. So I'm very excited for you. Thank you for letting me read it.
Thank you. Thank you. I appreciate it. Yeah. Definitely. I was looking for some new ideas. I guess I can move on from here.
I guess you already had them, actually. So we just helped you unearth them a little bit. But thank you very much. This is exactly what it is we're trying to do in this venue. And see you soon.
Thank you so much.
Everybody. Thank you.
Thanks, Hande.
Farewell. Yeah. Good luck.